The video you are watching is part 4 in a 5-part video series that describes a research paper entitled A Digital Humanities Database, a Tool for Accessible Democracy. My name is Lester Levitt. I am a PhD student in the School of Public Administration at Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, Florida. As noted, this is part 4 of a 5-part series. The icons that appear in the top left corner of every frame indicate which part you are watching at this point in time. As noted, this section is entitled Technology, Democracy, and the New Governing Paradigm. In outlining a new paradigm, I've had to come up with a name, and the name that I've chosen is MCIS Systems. It is a system that, multiple systems that are designed to create education initiatives and to create an accessible democracy. This particular paper is specifically about the accessible democracy. MCIS is an acronym for Media Omniverse Collective for Social Initiative and Enterprise. It very much is to build upon the idea of social entrepreneurship, but social entrepreneurship is far too nebulous of a topic to actually encapsulate the idea that this actually has within it an income generating mechanism. So MCIS systems come together as a system that is barrier free to participation, an open platform of free association so that anybody can participate. It is self-funding and income generating for the participants, and it has the non-hierarchical structure that is resistant to corruption that I talked about. The barrier-free idea is the idea that the protests of 2011 were all made possible through social media. There was no mechanism for government to use to actually stop that, and when they tried to shut down the internet, it actually increased the turnout of the crowds in the streets, and in particularly the Tahrir Square protests on that Friday of anger when the Egyptian government shut down all internet systems within the country. The MCIS systems are a socio-technical system made up of a vehicle, the engine for that vehicle, and the fuel that will actually propel the engine. The idea of having systems without engine or fuel is the metaphor which I wanted to capture, because the idea is that this crowdsourcing of data, this media creativity that drove so much of the narrative within the protest groups in 2011, the idea that there was all of this fuel available is what was driving me crazy as I was studying public administration and democratic systems. And so I wanted to capitalize on the idea that the fuel is there was just no engine and no vehicle. So putting together the organizational model so that this fuel could be framed and contextualized so that the discourse could be altered and a new governing narrative emerge. That's where the idea of an engine came from. And then the vehicle, I needed to put together an idea of how an organization could be structured, how an institution could be structured so that it was democratic, better than democratic, so that it actually was resilient to any kind of corruption, and so that the organizational elite, the global elite, and the lobbyists could not take over the system through a hierarchical structure. And so that's where the idea came up for this new governing model, this new model which I built in a three-dimensional frame here. So the fuel, we've talked about ideographs in part 1 and part 2, and how these ideographs as small, heavily laden images and documents can be put together in ways and framed together in order to create a governing narrative. Hugh Miller put it best when he wrote, "Hence, the way to conduct an argument is not necessarily at the factual level or even the experiential level, but perhaps at the ideographic level, where frames and metaphors are constituted." So that's where the idea of getting this fuel together came from. JPEGs and PNGs are digital media, and they're very easy to transport, and they're very easy to create with a cell phone camera, and they're very easily transmitted through technology, even low-grade technology, at little or no cost. This is an ideograph. The words "computers are totally gay" at the bottom are very, very heavily laden with connotation, and then that's what Dr. Miller talks about, Hugh Miller talks about when he talks about ideographs and how important they are in his work and in actually putting them together in narratives and arguments. Alan Turing was a mathematical genius. You've probably never heard of him. Most people haven't. His memory was effectively erased by the British government in 1954 when he was found out to be a homosexual. They chemically castrated him, and the medication that they put him on to do this made him very depressed. He committed suicide. It did not diminish his contribution to society, because it was his work from 1936 to 1948 that outlined how a central processing unit of a computer would work, and it was his mind that was successful in breaking the Enigma code, and essentially he is credited with saving Britain from being invaded by the Germans in World War II. So as part of trying to reinvent who Alan Turing is remembered as, there's a campaign put together this year in honor of his 100th birthday. Well, this would be the 100th year since his birth year, and they're trying to get him on a £10 note, of the British £10 note. So this is the idea of putting an ideograph out there that is very heavily laden and altering the discourse. So they want to change what people say and think about Alan Turing in a more positive note. But up until just recently, homosexuality was part of what we call a dialectical narrative. You either agreed with it or you disagreed with it. There was no lukewarm, there's no middle ground. And so when we have narratives that are dialectical, very little happens. You can't put together policy based on dialectical narratives. There's nothing to build on. There's no foundation to even start construction on. And so what I want to do is I want to put together a different way of looking at narratives so that compromise in the middle becomes possible. Log rolling up until the 1990s was how government got things done in the United States. Politicians would give a little here, take a little there, and they would come together, and eventually, through incrementalism, which is frustrating in and of itself, things still got done because they found this viable area in the middle between 3 and 7 in this diagram, where their compromise actually produced policy. So we've got to get back to that idea, but and as we think about the protest narratives of 2011, we've got to do it in a way that it actually builds upon digital media, and so that's what this idea is all about, and the paper gets into it in far more detail than I can talk at during a short video presentation. So the engine is this discourse structuration. The idea of actually putting the ideograph out there is only part of it. The actual objective at the end of the day is to have a new policy proposal come forward. In this case, in the case of Alan Turing, putting his image on the £10 note. So how do we know if we're making progress? Well, that's what we're going to deal with next. One way to do that is to think of more fleshed out ideographs. So let's look at personal blogs as ideographs. This is an excellent blog about a young lady who was, after she had had 2 children in the southern United States, her husband took a job in Canada. And so she compares her experience with universal health care in Canada against what she was taught as a child in the southern United States, where health outcomes were, I think, ranked 76th in the world. If some of the southern United States were ranked on the global scale, some of the states would actually rank below third world countries in healthcare. So she had been told all of her life that living in the South as a poor person with no health care was somehow better than it would be living under the restrictions of a Canadian universal health care system. So her blog fleshes out this kind of an idea of putting together discourse and structuring a new kind of discourse. So this is kind of what we're looking for. And this is the end of part 4, and final part 5, and the conclusion is the next video, which I encourage you to watch now.